everyone, my name is Ollie. This is a talk about why I think maybe you could throw away some of your JavaScript. We'll see. Can I get a show of hands from people who write any JavaScript at all? Okay, and who uses it? Keep your hands up if you use it as your main language that you write in. Interesting. Okay, so that's interesting. So most people write some JavaScript, but most people probably, it's not their primary language. Right, what am I going to talk about? The basic idea of the talk is I'm trying to work out what front-end framework I should use, if any, how I should build a front end. And I've been thinking about this since last year when I kind of went out on my own as a full-stack developer. So I thought I would talk about this, because it's something I've been looking into. So the bits of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm here tonight and what I want to talk about. I'm going to go through the history of web development, which is very ambitious. I put way too much into this talk, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to talk about my career and how like I have the JavaScript that I've written, the JavaScript that I've not written, and what I've kind of arrived at in terms of what I do at the moment. And then I want to talk a little bit about, this is the kind of meat of the talk, is could we be doing things differently? Are there different approaches from the kind of predominant web development paradigm that we find ourselves with? Then I'm going to do some tech demos, which are all going to go wrong. And then I'm going to arrive at some profound conclusions. Okay, that's the plan. Part one. So who am I? So I work at a very small startup. It's just me and one other guy I have for about 6 months or so, called RTU.Homes. I've only been a web developer since 2019. So the history, I'm looking back into the past. I didn't live any of this stuff, even though I'm almost 40. I wasn't around 20 years ago, and I live in Brighton. There's some real, take a lot of this with a big old pinch of salt, right? So as I said, I haven't been a web developer super long. I've never been a front-end developer, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. And the modern JavaScript ecosystem is a little bit alien to me. So although I'm going to criticize it, I don't really know what I'm talking about. But I have done some reading for this talk. So this is what I don't want this talk to be like. So here I am coming into Async, and I'm criticizing JavaScript. It's a JavaScript meetup. I don't want to be Jesus throwing the money lenders out of the temple like this, okay? It's not what I want. I want to be more like this small, naive boy just asking questions of the modern JavaScript ecosystem, right? I'm just asking questions, people. So, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just asking questions. There's a just asking questions meme. So let's go for the ill-informed overview of web development. So the web started in the 1990s. There's quite a lot of AI-generated images in this. You can spot the deliberate mistakes of people using smartphones in the 90s, but they're not actually smartphones. They look a little bit like smartphones. Web pages look like this. Very boring. And this is going to be the sort of framework that I use for this history, which is the relative status of HTML and JavaScript over the last 30 years almost. So in 1995, HTML was very high status. Everyone thought it was fantastic. It was the hot, new, exciting thing. JavaScript was a silly little toy language that nobody liked that was created in 2 weeks, and nobody thought would ever amount to anything. Both these things happened in 1995, so it's kind of where our story begins. And this is how web applications worked, such as they were. We had the server, and we had the client, which obviously wasn't a laptop. You've got to imagine a slightly less modern laptop there. And the computer just sent an HTML document to the client. Maybe there would have been a little bit of dynamic preparation of that HTML on the server, but it was very simple how it worked. This led to static websites, which were not very interactive, not very exciting. Then we go into the noughties. Take a moment to appreciate what life looked like in the noughties. Slightly different. Websites look like this, a little bit more exciting. And then I guess like 2005 is quite a pivotal year for all this stuff. So Google Maps was released, And it kind of gave people, for the first time, this view of JavaScript being used to create like an application, like an app-like experience, which people didn't really think was possible in the browser. This article was published, which I vaguely heard about before, talking about AJAX for the first time, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, because people thought that the payload that was returned from the server would be XML rather than JSON, but everyone quickly started using JSON instead. So it should be called AJAG, really, but it doesn't sound as good. And then jQuery was released in 2006. Darren here has a jQuery t-shirt, which he's wore especially for the talk, which is it's very supportive of him. Thank you. There was a lot of cross-browser inconsistency with JavaScript. So jQuery made it a lot easier to write JavaScript. And also a lot of the sort of modern features that we rely on didn't exist. So we kind of moved into this AJAX world using jQuery. Stuff was still server-side rendered, mainly, and sent over. But along with your HTML now, you get a little bit of JavaScript as well. And that JavaScript does a few little things, and it will query the server asynchronously to get a little bit of JSON, which it will then use to amend the DOM. So some little tweaks of interactivity. And that's jQuery sort of fiddling around with the DOM a little bit there, which is what happened in the noughties. And this is the sort of code that we would get. So you've got a function, which is presumably fetching some weather data from your server. And then you're finding your DOM node on the page, and then you're manually saying, right, this is what the HTML should be. It should have this result shoved in the middle of it. So a little bit messy. And this is the term that people use to describe this kind of unstructured JavaScript code, which is jQuery soup. And as I'll mention when I talk about my career, I have worked with older code bases, and I have sort of come across this. Yeah, it's hard to tell what's doing what where, and the sort of application logic and the DOM logic is all sort of mixed up, and it's not always a super fun time, unfortunately. So then we enter into the teenies. We actually have smartphones now. Hooray. What are you pointing there at?
I recognize that
guy. There's a web developer. Websites look like this. And then, OK, so now we're getting into the land, finally, of like single-page applications and structured JavaScript and front-end frameworks. So Angular and Backbone were kind of the first of those, released in 2010. And then in 2013, React was released. So now JavaScript's the hit thing. HTML's looking a bit on the sad side. It's gone down below JavaScript in our status column. Now, the way we make websites, we don't use any HTML at all. I mean, maybe I guess we send just like a single HTML with like a div in it, but that's just because we have to. We don't want to, right? We send a bucket load of JavaScript over. It takes ages to download now. And then the computer actually builds the HTML itself using that JavaScript, and then gets further JSON to amend what it's already built. And this is the kind of world of the teenies. And this is how that works. So React's got its own little in-memory model of what the DOM looks like, which it keeps track of. If it spots anything different on the actual DOM, then it will blow that away and create a new DOM element. And everyone's happy, and it's good. And this is what our weather app looks like now. So it's a bit more structured, and we're using JSX here. So we're mixing together our HTML. Our HTML is now in our JavaScript. There are problems with this approach as well, though. It's complex, so it means you basically need to have two applications. You need a front-end application, and you need a back-end application that's sending you the data. There are, as I understand it, it's not great for SEO because the web crawlers are not great at executing JavaScript. And as I mentioned, there's kind of that initial loading state, which is not ideal because we're downloading a load of stuff and building it on the client. Right. This is the world we live in now. If you wander outside, this is what you'll see. We're very much getting into things I don't know anything about now. So please do not ask any hard questions now. But this is the modern JavaScript world that we live in. Websites like this, very pretty, aren't they? Lovely now, the websites. But actually, my graph has slightly changed here in that we're suddenly seeing, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but the curve has sort of leveled off. And JavaScript's going down like a little bit, and maybe HTML's going up a little bit. So you're getting these like hybrid frameworks, as I understand it, like Next.js, which will pre-render some of your HTML on the server, which gets around some of those SEO problems, gets around some of those sort of cold start problems. And React Server components are a thing as well. So you're sort of mixing some of that logic from the front-end frameworks is now going onto the server. So yeah, similar to what we saw before, but maybe there's a little bit of HTML coming. Okay, so that's the world. Yeah, I don't know what the problems are with this approach, unfortunately. I'm sure it's probably great. I don't know. Maybe there aren't. So this is what has driven me to this talk. Is I am a back-end developer and I don't know how to write front-end code, and so I'm trying to work this out. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I have arrived at this situation. So an overview of my career to date since 2019, or how I have avoided writing an SPA. And can I carry on doing that? So I sort of finished a boot camp sort of thing in 2019. I previously had a long and illustrious career in the civil service, but I thought, hey, web development is where it's at. That's what I want to do. So 2019, I got spat out onto the job market. It's the first year I went to Async, 2019, so it's very exciting. And I worked for this company. I'm not going to mention any of the company's names because I'm slightly going to criticize their engineering practices, but it's very much not a secret if you want to go on my LinkedIn profile. So I worked for this company based in Brighton. It was kind of like a Wix for estate agents thing. It was a very old code base written in Ruby on Rails. Probably started about 2010, I think, when Ruby on Rails was the hot thing. We had like a few little React widgets, but basically everyone was a full stack developer and we were writing server rendered code and we were happy. It was good. They were good times. Then in 2021, I was there for a couple of years. Then I moved to this cybersecurity platform, which did have a React front end, and I was recruited as a Rails developer for the API, right? We've got the two apps. We've got the front end app and the back end app, and I was the back end developer. But all the while that I was there, I was kind of questioning, do we need these two teams that don't talk to each other as much? Well, they have to talk to each other all the time, but you can't. Nobody was working across both code bases, basically. And that had a real hit to how productive everyone could be. And the application really didn't use any of the single-page application functionality. There were maybe some lists of users. There were drop-down menus, but there was nothing that couldn't really be done server-side. And yeah, this approach slowed down development. So I was like, do we need these SPAs? Then last year, I thought, right, I've worked as a web developer for 4 years. I want to go out on my own now and do an exciting thing. I found a guy who wanted to start a company. I was like, right, I'll do it. But it's just me now, so I don't have a front-end team. So I've got to build my own front-end. How do I do that? We've talked about, I sort of vaguely mentioned, I looked at the additional complexity required for this sort of modern API plus front-end framework. There's a lot of additional things that you need, you know? And I wasn't sure that I wanted to get involved with all that stuff. I saw lots of stuff on Twitter saying that, you know, the modern front-end ecosystem is difficult. I love this. Everything okay, babe? You've barely touched the newest JavaScript framework. Is this the world that I want to get into? I wasn't sure. I don't know. And meanwhile, you know, I'm sort of like a Rails dev here. I'm very happy just to do what I'm told by the Rails community. Ruby on Rails has developed this slightly different approach, which is sending, rather than, so similar to Ajax, but rather than requesting JSON from the server, like a structured data object that is then interpreted by a whole load of code that's sitting on the client to render our HTML, this hotwire approach, which Rails is pushing, is you just send the HTML, right? So all your logic, all your domain logic all sits on the back end. And the front end, when it needs something a little bit reactive, it needs a little bit of logic, we'll just say, what should we do? And it will just send a little clump of HTML to the front end. I was like, this seems good. I'll give it a go. So this, it's this kind of structure, right? So we're still using Ajax, but we're just requesting like a little. We're not refreshing the whole page. We're not getting the kind of mid-noughties blink. When you click on a link, the whole page blinks. We're just doing a little discrete thing here. And this is the first app I built using this, which I demoed at Async in 2005 or sorry. What am I talking about? So I demoed in May last year. There we go, for anyone who was around for that. So yes, this is my app. It is a to-do list app that is integrated with ChatGPT. It's a nice little techie thing. Ignore the ChatGPT functionality here. I just want to show you, this is all, I mean, there is some JavaScript here, which I'll talk about, but a lot of this is using this kind of like HTML over the wire approach, you know, so we can edit this stuff in line. like this, and none of this is triggering a page load, right? This is all HTML being sent over the wire. And I was like, yeah, this seems pretty good. I can write apps like this. I don't have to get into the SPA, front-end ecosystem. I'm happy. What do we do now? Oh, hang on. I've opened a new tab. Oh, dear. Here we go. There we go. I think there we go. I'm back. There we go. I've got another meme. You can't see the joke on the meme. Tragedy. Hang on. Let's get rid of this guy. Hide for the joke. There we go. There we go. Let's get build up. So yeah, this is what I'm wondering. I'm like, well, why? This seems like a good way of doing things. All the JavaScript. Why isn't everyone doing this? I don't know. So I started kind of looking into the history of this approach, where it comes from, and trying to understand whether this is like a weird Rails thing or this is actually the future and that everyone should do this, So let's rewind a little bit back to 2010, which I think is kind of that dividing point where we started heading towards this SPA world and think, like, could we have taken a different approach? So in 2011, this library called pjax was released, which ended up being used quite a lot by GitHub, which was Ajax, and they used this push state web history API, which was new. We're getting some, what that is, some drilling. Someone's boiling a loud kettle. It's fine. Yeah. Anyway, apparently this is a thing. I'd never heard of this before, but apparently this is like one of the first, uses of this kind of idea. So because you had push state, you could now do something with Ajax, but then push the fact that you changed the page onto the history of your browser. So someone's like, great, let's build this. And until quite recently, actually, this was used by GitHub, or a variant of this was used by GitHub. Because GitHub, I guess because there's such a core part of, I don't know why, but they haven't changed their UI in a million years, and it's still server-side rendered Rails, right? So they've really faced this problem. And this has sort of been their solution for a while. Then in 2011, WebSockets was published, which didn't exist when the kind of SPA path was initially embarked upon. And as we'll see, that is useful for some of this stuff. And then in 2012, in the Rails side, this library TurboLinks was published. And what TurboLinks did was we're still trying to get around this kind of single page, this page refresh blink, right? Where you click on a link and the entire page reloads. So what TurboLinks did, it's a really simple idea. So whenever you click on a link, there would be JavaScript in the library that would say, I don't actually want to follow that link. What I want to do is, this is just any old HTML page. Don't look too closely. There's a lot of people trying to understand the weather app that I've created. Ignore, this is just any HTML. What it would do is it would keep all this stuff on the page, but it would use Ajax just to swap out the body. So it would say, right, go to the server, get me the body, and I'll swap that out, but I'll leave all this stuff. So my huge script.js file and my huge styles.css file, I don't have to download those again. And it just made Rails applications slightly snappier. So that came out in 2012. And then in 2018, Phoenix Live View was released. Hands up, who's heard of the Phoenix framework? Not very many people. Phoenix, yeah, cool. Okay, so Phoenix is this Elixir web application framework. So it's kind of like Laravel or Rails, but for Elixir. Elixir is based on Erlang, which is this functional program that people who are very into programming languages are very excited about. I don't know very much, and Erlang in itself was developed in Sweden in the 1980s by like telecoms engineers who needed like loads and loads of multiple connections at the same time. And thus, it makes it a very good language for web applications. And you can get like not millisecond, but microsecond response times, apparently, sometimes with Phoenix. So it's super, super fast. Anyway, these Phoenix guys, this is the framework developer, Chris McCord. He came up with this thing called Phoenix Live View, and he wrote about it. And essentially, it's the same idea, but using WebSockets. This is actually slightly wrong. It doesn't use HTML. It uses JSON, but it's kind of like HTML. I don't think we need to go into it. But if anyone wants to nitpick, it's not actually, it's actually JSON. But anyway, let's pretend it's HTML. It makes it easier for my talk. And WebSockets is great, right, with Elixir, right? Because a lot of web applications, it would be a significant burden to have like simultaneous connections with all your users at the same time. But if you're using Phoenix and Elixir, that's not so much of a problem. So it works really well for them. And this was the demo that Chris McCord did at the time. So this is like a thermostat. And this is achieved using no JavaScript. This is all done through these kind of like WebSocket connections to the back end. So whenever you click on one of these buttons, I don't quite know what's happening here. Is this cooling thing a button? I don't know. But anyway, these are definitely buttons, and that's clicking it up and down. Every time you do that, this is what's happening. So we've got the front end code on the right, which is the template that's being rendered. We've got the back end code on the left, and you'll see the anchor tags have got this phx click attribute, and that attribute is then calling code on the server, right? So we're handle event inc for increase. So if you click on the inc button, which is the plus, you'll update what's on the front end, you'll increment the value, and then you'll send that back to the front end. And because Elixir and Phoenix are so fast, this is like gives you a really responsive experience. And even this, they worked out how to make Snake using this approach because you've got such fast response times from the server. So I don't know how this works, but this was on the demo that Chris McCord did in 2018 that you can have like a real-time game running in the browser without any JavaScript, which is pretty cool. This guy, we're now moving over into the Laravel community. We're doing a full tour of the server-side rendered frameworks. Was very excited. This is like 6 weeks after that previous tweet, and decided to produce the same sort of thing for Laravel, which he then published. That should have been 2019. And then in 2021, and I should say the Laravel version didn't use WebSockets and wasn't quite as snappy and crazy and fast, but seemed like a good way of achieving similar levels of interactivity without requiring any JavaScript. And then in 2021, Rails did the same thing, and they released this product called Hotwire, which stands for HTML over the wire, which I think is quite a snappy name, right? Hotwire. So this is very much the exciting thing that everyone in the Rails world is talking about. This is Rails World 2023. There's all these Turbo and Hotwire talks. Everyone's talking about like the resurgence of Rails. Great, brilliant. So this is very much the world I'm in. But I thought, in presenting this content to you guys, maybe principally JavaScript guys, you're not going to be interested in some niche server-rendered framework. You want to know how you could do this in JavaScript, right? So I thought I would dig into this a little bit, the sort of JavaScript approach to this. And in 2020, a library, which does a similar thing to all these things, responds to a client-side request with a snippet of HTML rather than JSON, was released. And it was made by this guy, who I've actually become slightly obsessed with, this guy called Carsten Gross, who's seems like a super switched-on guy, lives in Montana. He is the author of HTMX. And he also wrote this book last summer called Hypermedia Systems. He's also, as well as being a web developer, he's a lecturer at University of Montana or something. And he's got a real deep expertise in the world. And he's also, I was listening to a podcast with him today, he said, we get pretty silly on Twitter. So they get pretty silly on Twitter. So if you follow, and I recommend you do, the HTMX org Twitter account, it's very funny. And you'll see from this recent poll that most people are just here for the memes. Some people are running production, not very many. And I don't know how much of this was just upvoting from meme fans, but in the 2023 JavaScript Rising Stars, HTMX was second behind React as a rising star. And he's also, this is a complete tangent, I don't know if you guys have come across grogbrain.dev. So this is the same guy, right? So grogbrain.dev, yeah, it is a very funny website, and it's got some really interesting nuggets of wisdom. It's basically like a caveman's view of web development. So it's got quotes like this: Apex Protocol Grog is complexity. Grog no able see complexity daemon, but Grog sense presencing the code base. Anyway, it's very good. That's complete aside, but it's the same guy, right? Okay, so tech demos. So I thought I would just try and show you and we'll see whether this works or not, how HTMX works in a little bit more detail. So I produced this new product called To-Do-Ligan. It's coming to a browser near you. It's made with HTMX. Can't be reached. Hang on. Let's start the server. Here we go. OK, so this is entirely built with HTMX. There is no JavaScript at all on the site here, but we can do some basic to-dos. Very basic. You can't even complete the to-dos. You can just delete them. But it didn't take me too long to do it. OK, so if I write here in this box, buy even more ham, we'll see it pops up down there at the bottom. And the way this is working is, so that field there is here. So if you look at this line of code, so this is a form element. It's making a post request to that endpoint. So I'm running a Rails server. HTMX is completely back-end independent. Doesn't care what server you're running as long as you return the right kind of response. It's targeting the to-dos list element, which we'll find here. Oh, no, wait, sorry, no. Here, there we go. So it's targeting that. And what it gets back is going to get back a little snippet of HTML from the server. And it's going to put that before the end of the target here. So let's examine that again. If I open up DevTools, I should make it a little bit more obvious and put a new to-do.
By green eggs?
By green eggs, yeah, great idea to go with the ham. Hopefully this will, yeah, here we go. So we've sent that off. It's been added to the bottom here. So here is our request. And you'll see the response is just a bit of HTML. And it just gets added to the bottom there. So nice and responsive. No need for any kind of JavaScript on the front end. What else can we do? We can delete these elements. So if I click here, you'll see that gets deleted. If we look at the response, the request, we're sending a delete request to this endpoint. The response is nothing. And if we look at the button, for which I'll have to open up this to-do partial. Apologies if this is a bit too Railsy, but it should just be HTML, really. So this is the button we just clicked. So now we're sending a delete request to this endpoint with this ID. And we're saying, what's the target? Well, it's the closest ascending up the DOM hierarchy element that is of class to-do row, which is this guy. And we're going to swap the outer HTML. But because nothing is being sent back, it's going to swap it with nothing. In other words, it's going to delete it. And then separately on the server, obviously, your server logic has to delete the record from the database. This is all backed by a database, right? So that's the delete button. So far, so good. And the other thing we can do, I think I've just got one more thing. Oh, yeah. One other thing. We can also do inline editing like this, which is pretty neat, right? Put ham on eggs like that, right? And what's happening there is if we look at the element, which is this to-do title here, you'll see again we're making a GET request to the edit endpoint. The target is this element itself, and we want to swap what we get back, the outer HTML. So the thing we got back was this. So this is actually a form. So this is this part where we swap it for that. So that actual form gets rendered. And then when we submit the form, it responds with this, which is just the element as it was. And you can even do, you can actually do some quite fancy things with this. You can also do, I haven't done it with this demo, but you can do infinite scroll using this. Quite a lot of things that you would think you would need JavaScript on the front end to do. But this is search. So if I type ham, I get just my ham-related to-dos. And there you'll see we're making, we're hitting the get endpoint for the to-dos, but we've got a search parameter in there. And what's being returned is like the full list of to-dos, but only the ones that meet that search parameter. So there you go. So that's the sort of thing that you can do with HTMX. Are there any questions on that? Because I appreciate that was quite a lot of code. That is fine. Yes?
Strange
Translation to, that's a really good question. If we oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Where were we? Okay. Right, quick recap. It's a lot of slides, isn't it? It's quite a lot of slides. I'm trying to do too much. Cool. Okay. And I think an interesting point about HTMX, and this guy Carson Gross, is he's actually saying this isn't like a library that he wants to exist. He thinks that this is what HTML should do natively. He wants the HTML spec to be amended to allow this kind of behavior. So it wouldn't say hx get or whatever. It would just be like an inbuilt, I don't know, just get as a possible attribute on your HTML element. And I think this is, you can sort of see this idea of like a core functionality initially being added to with kind of plugins or scripting, which then is so popular that people think, well, let's just expand the core to take account of this. So, here are some examples. So jQuery had the ability to select elements using the CSS tags, and this eventually got added into JavaScript or the DOM API, I guess. And there's some other examples of this. So I can sort of see this happening. It's not completely crazy. So yeah, we've shown you what I've shown you what HTMX and these kinds of libraries can do, and they are good, but they won't do everything. There are kind of other. I have found that there are situations where you need to do a bit more, that you need some actual scripting languages. So you could just use jQuery again, but people don't like that anymore. So here are some sort of modern options that I'll just talk about very briefly that people talk about in the context of HTMX and Hotwire, some sort of JavaScript options and why they might be a little bit better. So Hyperscript is like completely nuts. And this is Carson Gross again. So this is his idea. And this, I don't recommend you use this at all because it's not built on JavaScript. Everyone knows JavaScript. This is just like a wild thing, but I thought I'd mention it. And it is quite cool. So if anyone remembers or has heard of HyperCard, which was a language used on Apple Macs in the early 90s, and was like a hypertext protocol before the internet that you could use on Apple Macs. HyperCard, this is that kind of syntax, and he's a fan of that. So he's like, let's let's do scripting on the web with HyperScript. But we don't want to do that. Stimulus is what I use. So this is the kind of Rails option. And it's basically the same as vanilla JavaScript. But it's slightly different in that your stimulus files, which are called stimulus controllers, are attached to elements in your markup. And they will only work with those elements. So if you have a hello controller, that will only work and for the rules that you put in place for that controller will only work on elements that have this data controller, right? So you're scoping your JavaScript to particular HTML elements. And you are then, in the markup, you're creating connections between your JavaScript and your HTML. So if we click on this button, it's going to trigger this greet method in the controller. And this is the kind of thing you get in the controller. So I use this. It's great. It works with Rails, but also you can use it in any other project. It's just a JavaScript library. Going slightly further is this framework called Alpine.js, which I've built this application with called Your Counter. It's coming soon. It's an exciting new application. No one's buying it. Here we go. So this is written in Alpine. And if I go over, yes. Oh, I did, yes. Oh, no. Do I need to go, what, StreamYard?
Yeah, it's tapped off.
It has. Yeah, I cleverly got confused and deleted the whole window. Oh, sorry, I got it. It's saved in the thing. So do you want to click some? Great. Cool, thank you. Cool. All right, so this is, where did we got to? It was here, wasn't it? So here's a toggle button. And it toggles, not very exciting. Let's get rid of all this to-do stuff, because this is obviously a completely different app now. So this is the JavaScript using Alpine, which is also the cool new thing. And this API in the markup here is based on the Vue markup. I don't know if anyone's used Vue components, but it's very similar. So like, whereas do you get, is it Vue X? I can't remember exactly what it was, but is it Vue data? Anyway, it's basically copied that because he's a big Vue fan, but he's like, can we do it without as much JavaScript? So here we're starting this element and we're passing it this attribute of open, and we're giving it an initial value of false, which you saw there. And then when we click on it, we're reversing that value. So it's kind of got data binding with JavaScript that's running on the page. And then this X show is like deciding whether or not to show the stuff that's within this div. And if open is true, then it will. And if open is not true, then it won't. So that's how we're toggling there. And then within that, we've just got a little bit more functionality. So here, we've got another kind of Alpine component, I guess you might call it. And we're passing it this count attribute, which we're initializing at 0. And then on a click, we're going to increase that. As I understand it, this is just JavaScript running in your page. So it's just using your JavaScript memory. And then at the bottom there, we're displaying that variable here. So there you go. Yeah.
Is count scoped?
Scoped to, yes, I think it'll be scoped to that element. I think so. Yeah. But it might not be. But I think it is. I think that's kind of the point. So that's much simpler. That's all I've got to show you on that. But I thought I would mention that because HTML is often paired with Alpine.js. And there's this guy who's come up with this idea of the AHA stack. So using HTMX and Alpine together, and Astro. Has anyone heard of Astro? Yes. Okay, so Astro, as I understand it, is like it uses JavaScript, and it's a modern framework, but it's trying to be a kind of purely server-side rendered framework, but using JavaScript. And yeah, cool. All right, I'm nearly done, to be honest. But the one other thing I wanted to talk about, and it kind of is related to what those little snippets that we just saw, particularly in Stimulus and Alpine, which is about another Carson Gross idea. This is his website, Carson Gross, HTMX, locality behavior, which is expressing this idea, which is that if you want to make your code easy to maintain, you want to put similar things together, which is the complete opposite idea from separation of concerns, right? Which you might have heard before. So don't mix your view logic in with your application logic, in with your database logic, right? But, and I've not heard a huge amount of discussion of this sort of separation of concerns versus locality of behavior. But it occurs to me that actually we see this quite a lot in discussions about web development technologies, sort of where we fall on this axis. So this is disorganized code. So this is what your code looks like. You're having a very bad day. All the elements are jumbled together. It's often called the big ball of mud architecture. It looks very good as an expressionist painting, but not as code. So this is typically what I think separation of concerns tells us, sort of what I was told you should do. So you should separate things by their format. So you should put all your markup together in one place in a unique set of files, and you shouldn't mix them up, and your styling and your application code. But I feel like increasingly we're getting this like code organized by function, i.e. components, right? So this is basically JSX, right? When JSX came out, everyone's like, this is horrible, you're mixing your markup and your application logic. But people actually kind of liked it. And people thought it was more maintainable. And Alpine is saying, right, basically that you put all of your JavaScript in line, essentially, in little components. And that this is how we avoid jQuery soup, right? Because the thing about jQuery is you had this thing, spooky action at a distance, right? So your JavaScript code was amending the DOM. You didn't know which JavaScript, right, was amending the DOM that was here right in front of you, the markup right in front of you. So maybe this is a good principle. And this is stuff we kind of need to think a little bit more about if you are going to drop a front-end framework. Because if you are going to start manually editing the DOM with JavaScript, you just kind of need to think a little bit more about how you organize that. And yeah, I just sort of threw together this slide assessing some of these frameworks that we talked about in terms of where they fall on this axis, and then also, I guess, on the axis of, I've written complexity, but you could say sort of richness of UI. And the other thing to mention here is like Tailwind, which is exactly that locality of behavior. And everyone loves it, right? But it's completely goes against the idea of separation of concerns. And that, I think, is another example of the kind of return of HTML, right? Like everything increasingly is being put in the markup, like the JavaScript and the CSS styling. So, right, I'm wrapping up now. What are my conclusions? This is a very pretentious slide. I read this book called The Collapse of Complex Societies, which states that it analyzes various societies throughout history and says that the reason that they collapsed is because they got diminishing returns to complexity. So like the Roman Empire became increasingly complex and was taxed more, and actually people were really struggling as a result of this additional complexity. And then inevitably, complex societies face this kind of complexity ratchet where they get more and more complex and they try and solve their problems with more complexity, and eventually they collapse, right? I'm not going to say anything, but draw your own parallels. And then also, I think like you've got to understand what kind of application you're actually building, right? Are you building Wikipedia or are you building Spotify? So if you're building this, you should never build this with HTMX or Hotwire. That would be absolutely insane. This is like a desktop app in your browser. This has to be a single page application. But going back to my experience at my last company, like we weren't building this, but we had a single page application. Similarly, if you're building something a bit like this, I mean, this, to be honest, is more simple, probably, I don't know, than a lot of the stuff I've been asked to build. You know, most of the stuff I've built have kind of sat somewhere in the middle where we need like a little bit of functionality. You need to like validate things, put into forms. You need like drop-down menus. You might need to like sort data in a table. You want inline editing, but you don't want a full desktop app in the browser. And I think the kind of technology I've talked about, for my purposes, you know, kind of work fine. Yeah, and the last thing I guess, yeah, is that maybe some people, I don't know, because I'm not really in that world, maybe some people think things like Laravel and Rails are like consigned to the dark ages and just aren't any good anymore. But actually, I think they work in a lot of cases, and they remain a good option for some people. there we go. Thank you very much.